Hi everyone, welcome to Free Prep Hour. My name is Allie Bell and I'll be your instructor tonight. I have been an LSAT instructor with Manhattan Prep for about 10 years now, and I live in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I'm looking forward to working with all of you today. Before we get started, I just wanted to make sure you're comfortable with your main tools for participation tonight. The main way that I'll be asking you to participate throughout class is via either a poll that I send you that will just ask you to put in the answer that you found for a question, or through the chat. So I'm going to say hello to you in the chat, and I would love it if you would take a moment to introduce yourself. In particular, I'd love to know your name, where you are in the world, and where you are at in your LSAT journey. So for example, are you in the middle of an LSAT course right now? Are you just poking around and learning about the LSAT? Are you someone who had signed up for the April LSAT and is waiting to find out if it'll run? Would love to just learn a little bit about you. So take a moment. I'll just pause myself for a second and let y'all say hi. Great, nice to meet you, Rob, Virginia. Nice to meet you, Kayla. Very impressive. Studying an hour a day, that's awesome. Awesome. Looks like we've got folks from all over the country and folks who are in all different places in their LSAT journey. That's great. Thank you for introducing yourselves. Keep it coming. If you need a little bit more time, that's totally fine. I'm going to go ahead and share the plan for today. Before I do that, a couple additional options for you if you are studying for the LSAT and you're looking for some more free prep. One is our live LSAT classes. We offer classes online. We also, during normal times, offer classes in person in most major cities, but right now all of our classes are online for the moment to keep our students and instructors safe. Katya, yeah, you found the right chat window, nice work. You are able to sign up as a trial student for any of our courses, and if you're a trial student, you get to go to the first session of any of our classes for free. And it's a 3-hour session primarily filled with content focused on logical reasoning and logic games. Really useful stuff, and it gives you a feel for what it's like to be in our classes. You also have the opportunity to try our product called LSAT Interact, which is a really amazing interactive adaptive video series that covers our complete LSAT curriculum. Basically, it goes through everything you need to know to be successful with logical reasoning, logic games, and reading comp, taught by our instructors, and it provides you with actual practice questions and adaptive feedback based on those questions. So you can check out those resources on our website if you're interested in finding out more. Today's lesson is going to be focused on reading comprehension, and we're going to focus on a particular passage type of reading comprehension. I'm so glad you're happy to hear that, Virginia. I love that reaction. Thank you. That makes my day. The type of passage we're going to focus on is called a comparative passage. And for those of you who are new to the LSAT, basically what that means is instead of reading one long passage that's from one point of view, you read two shorter passages. They're labeled passage A and passage B. and they're told from two different perspectives. So they have two different authors. And you're asked some questions about each passage individually, but also some questions about how they overlap or how they relate to each other. So most of our session tonight is going to be just trying a comparative passage, seeing how we should think about those comparative passages and what types of questions we're going to face. Before we get into that, though, I do want to talk a little bit about what this will look like on test day. So as you may know, the LSAT is now administered digitally, which is a change that's been made over the past year. And so as we go through the passages in our practice today, it won't look exactly like it's going to look on test day. So I want you to know what it's going to look like on test day. So this is what the reading comprehension interface looks like for the LSAT, and it's administered via an iPad, and you have a stylus that you can use. And for a reading comprehension passage, you're going to have two choices. One is to have this view where you have the passage on the left and the questions on the right. It won't show the whole passage, so you'll need to scroll down as you read. And then you can see that the different passages and question sets are delineated by little bars at the bottom, so you can see where each passage and its accompanying questions begin and end. You can also go to passage only view, which will display only the passage on the screen. We found that view to be a little bit clunky and less useful than this view, so I recommend just staying in the passage with the questions view, but you can experiment and see what you like better on the LSAC website and get comfortable with the digital platform, which I highly recommend doing before you take the actual test. There are some annotation tools available to you for reading comprehension. So for those of you who find it helpful to mark up the passage, you can use the highlighter or the underline tool. If you choose to use that, you may find it helpful to make the font size a bit larger and adjust the spacing to be farther apart. The highlighting tool can otherwise be a little bit imprecise, so making those adjustments will make it easier for you to use accurate highlighting. You'll also have scratch paper. So what we recommend is to use the highlighter or underlining tool pretty sparsely, and to also use your scratch paper to take notes. And then your question will look like this. You'll have the option to eliminate answer choices using these tools. It's actually a pretty great tool. When you click it, it not only eliminates that answer choice, it makes it kind of go gray so that the answer choice is that you have remaining really kind of pop out at you. And then you can flag questions for review. So just wanted to share that with you so you'll get a feel for what it will look like. The questions we're going to be seeing tonight are from older PDF forms of the LSAT, so they won't look exactly like this, but we can still approach them in the same way that we would on test day. All right, so let's dive into comparative passages. I'm going to show you one in just a moment. Before I do, I'd just like to give you some thoughts on what you might focus on as you're reading a comparative passage. So as you read a comparative passage, again, you're going to have two passages. And here's what you want to focus on. And Katya, absolutely. So we'll talk a little bit about that right now. So Katya is asking, what kind of notes should we be taking on scratch paper for reading comp for the digital test? So what I recommend doing on your scratch paper and what I do on mine is to create something that I call a passage map. And this is something that is useful not only for a comparative passage, but really for any reading comprehension passage. And the basic idea of a passage map is as you go through a passage, you're paying attention to the major ideas and viewpoints within each paragraph. So if the first passage, let's just say it has 3 paragraphs, my passage map might look something like this. And as I read each paragraph, I'm trying to use maybe 5 words or fewer to capture what I see as the essential opinion and or purpose of each paragraph. Now, it's really important that I don't conflate that with the first sentence of each paragraph. Sometimes the purpose or main idea of a paragraph will be expressed in the first sentence, But on the LSAT, not all of the time. So what I generally do is read the full paragraph, and then I pause and I digest that information, and I try to identify, okay, what was the main viewpoint that was expressed there, or what was the purpose of that paragraph. And perhaps it's a paragraph that expressed two viewpoints, so I might jot that down, that expressed these two different viewpoints. So this kind of the goal is that by the time you're done reading the passages, you have an outline of the purpose and or opinion for each paragraph, but that is pretty brief. And what we'll do is after I let you read this next passage that we're going to practice with, we can make an example of a passage map so you can see exactly what that might look like. All right, so let's get ready to read. Before I put the passage on the screen, you're going to want to make sure that you have some paper so that you can take notes. You may want to put this window in full screen if it's not already, so that the text appears nice and large for you to be able to see. If it's not in full screen, you can go to the top of your Zoom window, and under where it says you are viewing Allison Bell's screen, next to it will say view options, and you can select that and choose the view that you'd like to use. When you're reading on reading comprehension, you generally want to give yourself somewhere between 3 and 4 minutes per passage, with 4 being kind of the very upper end of the spectrum. And it's a range because everyone reads at different rates, and also because not all passages are created equally. So if you're reading a passage and you're finding that it's really making sense to you, the ideas are clicking, and you're able to quickly and easily identify the opinion and the main purpose of each paragraph, then you might not need to take as much time to read that passage. And in fact, you might not even need to take as many notes. On the flip side, if you're reading a passage that feels very technical, very challenging, you find yourself frequently stopping and feeling confused or needing to reread, then that might be a place where you would want to slow down a bit. All right, so that's all that I'm going to say about this. I'm going to switch now to the passage, and when I do, I'm going to hop off the camera so that you don't feel me hovering, but I'm still right here, and I'll be back in a few minutes. And I'm going to time you. I'll give you about 3.5 minutes to read the passage, and then we're just reading the passage right now. We're not doing any questions, but we will. We'll do the questions one at a time in a few minutes. So just take this time to take your notes and get a good read in, and we'll proceed from there. All right, here we go. All right, that is 3.5 minutes. So take a moment to think about how you used your time. When you are working on improving in reading comprehension, it's really important to not focus solely on the questions, but to also take the time to invest in your reading process. And one of the ways to do that is to always make sure that when you're doing practice and you go back and review it, that you don't only think about how you answered the questions, but that you also think about how you approached the read. So in addition to whether you've got the questions correct, you might think about things like how well were you able to stay calm and focused? Let me make that a little bit bigger during your read. When you look back at your notes or your passage map, is there a clear sort of set of footprints of the main ideas in the passage? Are you able to quickly and easily synthesize what the big points of the passage were? What did you do when your comprehension lagged a little bit? It happens to all of us. We have moments where something doesn't fully make sense to us or we space off for a second. But we want to make sure that we're doing things to repair our comprehension in those moments. So did you go back and reread? Did you jot down some notes? How did you help yourself get back in the zone and understand the challenging part of the passage? And how was your pacing in your reading? Do you need to work on ways to pick up the pace? Are you perhaps going a bit slower than you need to? Those are all things that you want to consider when you're reviewing. All right, so I'm going to adjust my screen share to give us a little more room to write here. And I want to kind of share with you, in the interest of Katya's question, what my notes would look like for this and how I might mark up the passage itself. Now, typically, I would probably just do one or the other of those things. So I would either mark up the passage or take notes. But I'll show you both just so that you can see something that matches the method that you would use. So I would start with passage A. And as I go through that first paragraph, I'm looking for major ideas or opinions. So what I notice is that it kind of opens with a pretty neutral statement talking about what law enforcement agencies can do. They can decline to prosecute violators, and that's not really an opinion. But then we do get an opinion. This appears to be exercised frequently. And then we get a really clear statement of the purpose of the passage. I attempt here to explain why. So what I have jotted down on my notes from when I read this passage was LEA for law enforcement agencies, decline prosecution often. Notice I use a little bit of shorthand. My goal with my notes is not to be able to come back and read these later. My goal with my notes is just to build my comprehension and be an active reader as I go through the passage. And then I was really excited that the author tells us the purpose of the passage in the first paragraph. So I put why with kind of a colon here to indicate that the rest of my passage map and the rest of the passage would address the why. So then going into the second paragraph, it's really tempting to just immediately focus on this first sentence, which does seem to be an opinion that they're almost always all over-inclusive. But before I just jot that down, I want to make sure I get a sense of how this all comes together. What does the author have to say about it? So I'm going to mark this. They're almost always over-inclusive. And then the author goes on to talk about the challenges of being under-inclusive, and then says there is a way, and I see this but right here. So I've got a transition. I pay attention to that. Here comes a new idea. Called discretionary enforcement, where we can kind of get the best of both worlds. So I'm going to jot that down for paragraph 2. I do usually number these. I've got paragraph 1, paragraph 2. I jotted down laws are usually over-inclusive, discretionary non-enforcement is a fix for that. And then going into the third paragraph, I again read the whole paragraph to get the gist of what it's about. And this time, what I noticed is that it's focused on this idea of whether this is going to sort of be, this discretionary non-enforcement will be done in the spirit of the law. And they mentioned this idea of capricious enforcement. Is this going to be enforced sort of just capriciously? And so I see that the author shares an opinion. This seems unlikely. So that's what I'm going to jot down here. Capricious enforcement is unlikely. Again, if you hadn't read the passage, you probably would have no idea. Even if you had read the passage, you might have no idea what my notation means, but that's not why it's there. It's just there to help me understand. So now going into passage B, my main goal is to think about how does passage B connect back to passage A? Does it further the same point? Does it provide an example? Does it provide a counter perspective? And when I start reading passage B, what I notice right away is that compared to passage A, which was mostly theoretical, passage B is offering a very specific scenario. So I'm thinking that passage B is offering me a specific example. And what I'm going to need to think about as I go through passage B is how does this specific example fit with the broader theory that the author, a different author, described in passage A? How are these two related to each other? So in passage B, in the first paragraph, I get a sort of neutral description of this particular situation in the city. And I'm thinking, okay, I don't see a ton of opinions here. So I'm kind of wondering just what of this paragraph relates most clearly back to passage A. So I notice that they've got this idea of selectively cutting the water in only certain neighborhoods for these people who are late paying their bills. So immediately my brain goes back to this idea of discretionary non-enforcement, and we're only going to prosecute some of the violators, some of the people who are not paying their bills. So I'm going to jot down late paying selective enforcement. And then I'm going to go into paragraph 2. Paragraph 2, I seem to start getting some opinions from the author of passage B, who, keep in mind, is not the same author as passage A. We've got a but that indicates here comes another viewpoint, here comes a particular perspective. And then the author of passage B suggests why not attach a lien to the property. Here are some reasons why. Now I'm going to share a secret with you of reading comprehension here. I don't think that I could tell you exactly what the word lien means. I mean, I've seen it before for sure, and I have kind of like a vague sense of what it means from this passage, but could I define it for you right here? No. Am I going to let that stop me from getting the questions on this passage right? No. I'm going to focus on what I know. I'm not going to get hung up on what exactly is a lien, because I can still kind of capture the big idea of this passage, which is, okay, the author is saying, let's find this other way of handling the situation. Let's instead do this thing called attaching a lien, whatever that means. And then the author explains kind of the reasoning of why this might be a good situation. And then in the final paragraph, the author answers their own question. They ask, why not attach a lien? Oh, well, there is a loophole. Maybe we should change the law. So I'm going to jot down AO. AO for me stands for author's opinion. Loophole, change the law. And again, thinking back to how does this specific example relate to passage A, I know that they talked a little bit in that second paragraph about the dangers of making a law overly specific and that it creates these loopholes. So I noticed a connection between the final paragraph of this passage and the second paragraph of passage A. So this is my goal. I want to have a clear passage map. I want to have some footprints, whether those are on paper or in writing, that help me track the big ideas of the passage. And I want to have a general sense of how these two passages are related to each other, whether that happens just up here in my head or it's something that I spell out a little bit on paper. All right, so that's passage reading. I'm going to pause for a second, and if you have any questions about how to go about reading the passage or taking notes, you can put them in the chat now. Otherwise, we will start some questions in just a moment. Okay, I'm going to clear this off. Okay, I see a couple questions coming in there. Yeah, I agree. I certainly have encountered a lot of people who aren't big fans of reading on a screen. And I am also not a big fan of reading on a screen. The first thing I would say is going back to, here, I'll come back to this slide that we had a second ago. You'll just basically want to practice with this form as much as possible so that you get comfortable with it. It can be really tempting to focus on your, textbooks and written material that you have on paper because that's your preference. But you'll want to practice figuring out what strategies work for you when you're actually operating on a screen. So to the extent possible, you'll want to practice this way. You can make the screen a little bit more appealing to you by adjusting the font size, the spacing, and the brightness. So figure out what settings are best for you. And then I would encourage you to just really think about making the passage into smaller chunks deliberately. That's why I find stopping at the paragraph break so helpful because it allows me to just tackle a small amount of text at a time. Which for me helps when I have to read a lot of material on a screen. Katya asked, do I get bogged down in the details? My goal is definitely not to get bogged down in the details. And what I keep in mind is that the details aren't going anywhere, right? The passage is going to stay right here next to my questions the whole time that I am working to answer the questions. So honestly, especially if I'm pressed for time, sometimes the details are things that I might read faster and pay less attention to, particularly if it says like, for example, or gives me like a long list. Anytime it's like elaborating on a point, and I'm like, yeah, I already get the point. I allow myself to move more quickly past those details and really focus on what the big ideas are. I think, again, that process of reading the whole paragraph and then making a decision about what was important can be really helpful with that, because if I'm just committed, like, okay, I'm just going to read this whole thing and I'm going to put eyes on every sentence, then I'm not going to pay more attention to one than the other until I get to the end of it. And I'm trying to decide what was important there. Okay. Let's try some questions. Those were great questions. Thank you. Keep them coming and let me know if I didn't fully answer anything for anyone. All right, I'm going to give you about a minute to try this first question. When a minute is up, I will pop back up on screen and give you a poll. And Katya, I'll answer your question in the chat. Okay, that's about a minute. I'm going to send a poll your way, and I just would like for you to go ahead and tell me what answer you would select. All right, thank you to everyone who voted. So let's talk a little bit about the big picture in terms of what question type this is. So you'll notice that it asks you for something that is mentioned in both passages, and it uses the word explicitly. So this is an example of an overlap question. These are unique to comparative passages in that they're, this is the only type of passage where you're going to find these questions that ask you, how do these passages overlap? And this particular one is an identification question, which means it's just asking you to identify a very specific detail that showed up in both passages. And because it's an identification question, because it's asking you for something explicitly mentioned, we have a very high bar for the right answer in that it needs to be clearly stated, basically word for word in both passages. That's not going to be the case for all question types, right? So there are a lot of questions on the LSAT where we make inferences, we interpret the text a little bit, the answer choices don't match the text. But for these types of questions, if it's explicitly stated in both passages, we want to see those actual words show up. So of these answer choices, the only one that's explicitly stated in both passages is this idea of a loophole. And notice how little interpretation you need to do here, right? You don't need to figure out what they say about loopholes or what do they believe about loopholes. You just got to find the word, find the spot in the passage where they mention loopholes and kind of prove it to yourself. So the correct answer to this one is C. And oftentimes when folks get this one wrong, it's because maybe they found something that was in one passage but not the other. Maybe they interpret it a little bit rather than finding where it actually says the answer. Or maybe they relied a little bit on memory and they were like, well, I remember that they generally talked about one or the other of these things. So the key to getting these questions right is to be willing to invest the time in a text search, which is going to be a lot easier if you have a strong first read of the passage and a clear mental map. All right, let me know if you have any questions on this one. And we are gonna try another question. I'll give you another minute. All right, that was a minute. Here comes another poll. Tell me what you think. Okay, got a lot of answers coming in. Thank you for your participation. Great, okay, thank you. So let's talk about this. So this is a bit of a different beast than the last question. As you recall, the last question asked us for an overlap between passages A and B. Now we're shifting to just a question about passage B. So this is one of the challenges of comparative passages, is that they're going to go back and forth between look at passage A, look at passage B, look at both of the passages. And you have to be really attentive and constantly put your eyes back on the text. Working in such a high pressure scenario, it's really easy for our brains to blend the two passages. So I don't rely a lot on memory for this type of task. Also, the last question asks us to explicitly find a certain detail, but here we're being asked to infer. So what that means is that I can anticipate that I'm not going to find necessarily the exact words that it says in the answer choice, but I should be able to find clear text evidence to support these answer choices. Now, with inference questions, one of my favorite ways to think about them is to think about which of these answer choices is the most provable. And which one do I have sort of the strongest evidence? Like, you took me to a court of law and you said, answer choice C, prove it. Where does it say that in the text? Like this were a legal contract or something. What can I come up with the best proof for? And one of the things that I can think about without even looking at the text is just how strongly worded are the answers. Because the more strongly worded something is, the harder it's going to be to prove. So a lot of times my eyes are drawn immediately in questions like this one to the strongest language in any of the answer choices. And I'm thinking that's what I would have to prove if I want to pick this answer. So I'll show you some examples, like answer choice A and B both use the word most. So my eyes go to that and I'm saying, does it really say most? I see rarely in D. I see only in E. And then I also, my eyes go to this sort of judgment, value judgment here. It is appropriate, which is kind of strongly worded in a different way, right? Providing an opinion. So those are the things that I'm going to be looking to verify. Now, of course, the entire answer choice needs to be accurate and verifiable based on the text. But I like to identify certain sort of red flag areas that I think are going to be the most easy to disprove, because I'd like to eliminate answer choices as quickly as possible as I go through each question. So let's take a look at these answer choices. We'll start with A. So I'm looking only at passage B. It says most water customers are late in paying their water bills. All right, let me see what information we have about this. So it tells us the number of people who are late and how late they are, how much money they owe, but it doesn't tell me how many people there are total in the city who are supposed to be paying water bills. So I don't really have a sense of the proportion. So I'm going to cross this one off on my first pass. Answer choice B, most of the residents with outstanding water bills are in the city's high income neighborhoods. Okay, so this is where my mental map comes in handy, right? If I've done my job well, I'm going to recall that the high income neighborhoods were discussed in paragraph 1. And I'm going to think before I start searching the whole text, I'm like, okay, what paragraph do I need to focus on? Paragraph 1. All right, so paragraph 1, my eyes are scanning for high income neighborhoods. I see it here. What did they say about that? They say they're going to target only high income neighborhoods to make examples of privileged residents. Compare that to most of the residents with outstanding water bills are in the high income neighborhoods. Okay, that's not a strong match. It's not saying how many people are high income. It's just saying those are the ones they're going to cut off the water to. So I'm going to cross off B. And again, if I were taking the digital LSAT, I'd be clicking the little button off to the side to eliminate these, and they'd be going gray as I pass through. It is appropriate to turn off the water of high-income residents who pay their water bills a few days late. So again, I'm thinking paragraph 1, right, is where they talk about this. But I remember that paragraph 1 was pretty neutral and that the author didn't offer an opinion until the latter two paragraphs, and that opinion was focused kind of on something else, more on the author's different idea. So I'm going to cross this one off. The author seemed to think a different idea would be better, so this is almost a little bit the opposite of what the author says. In recent years, the city has rarely, if ever, turned off the water of customers who are late paying their water bills. All right, so again, my brain is telling me, let's go back to paragraph 1. That's where we've got the information for this. I see they're late paying their bills. There's a lot of them. Some of them have been late for decades. They owe a lot of money. They're planning to selectively cut the water. So it doesn't really directly say that the city has pretty much never turned off the water, but I could see someone making a case for it, because it's saying, like, we've got all these people who haven't paid their bills in decades, and they're going to start this plan that sounds pretty new to start cutting off water. So it seems like reasonable to conclude this. So I'm going to leave it for now. It's not perfect. All right, and then E says the only reasonable solution is to enact a law that classifies water bills as taxes. Okay, that's tempting. I remember the author talking about that in the last paragraph. The author says, if the problem is with the law, why not change it? And then referring to the idea that they're not taxes. But that word only is really getting me, because the author is throwing this out as an idea, but the author never says this is the only way to accomplish this, or that it's the only reasonable solution, just kind of is the author's solution. So I'm going to cross this off, and by process of elimination, I'm going to choose D. And if you can't tell, I don't love D. I don't feel that D is 100% proven, but that's not always my job on an inference question. My job is to figure out which of these answer choices is the most provable. And the LSAT is not always going to give me super cut and dry, easy to prove statements, because that would make the test too easy. So they make it a challenge to decide which of these do I have the most evidence for. And in this case, the one I have the most evidence for is D. All right, let me know if you have questions about that. And I'm going to give us another question. Here we go. All right, let's pull in. Okay, thanks. So we've got another overlap question, but this one relates to the overlap between the purpose of a detail, or in particular, the purpose of an individual word. So anytime I'm asked to find the purpose of something that is, more narrow than the entire passage, I really want to think about context. So I want to read around the detail, kind of do a context sandwich and figure out what was that detail doing in the first place before I start looking at answers. So I'm asked about the role, not just the word, right? So I'm not just looking for a synonym, I'm looking for a word that kind of does the same job. So I'm going to go back to the passage and, okay, it's telling me to look at line 42 for the word selectively. So they're selectively cutting the water to a few residents to show they're serious about collecting those debts. Okay, so I'm going to kind of make a prediction here that this word is being used to talk about a situation where they're sort of enforcing some, but not all the way, but not for everyone. And I do remember that when I made my passage map, I connected this idea back to the idea of discretionary non-enforcement. So my eyes go straight to this word discretionary in answer choice D. And if I were, struggling for time, I might trust my judgment there because I kind of anticipated that that would be what the answer is. But I'm not struggling for time right now. I'm having a great time hanging out with y'all. And I've got plenty of time to go through these answers. So let's take a look at the other alternatives and think about how those words compare. So we'll start with particularly in line 12. It says the more particularly it tries to describe the conduct, the more loopholes it will create. So that sounds kind of like they're saying how narrowly are we describing the law, which sounds a little bit different from how are we enforcing the law. It's kind of like what actions are included within the law itself, but not how are we deciding who gets punished for following the law and who doesn't. So I'm gonna rule this one out. Probability, I'm skeptical of because it's a noun, and my word selectively is an adverb, but I'm gonna check it out. 17, reduce the probability of acquitting a guilty one. That's pretty different. That's just saying the likelihood, which is pretty different from my predicted kind of definition and rule. So I'm gonna cross that off. Alternative in line 22 also is one that I would probably cross off kind of immediately. An alternative is just another option, and that's not really close enough to this idea of enforcing for some but not all for me to go check it out. Discretionary is where they talk about sort of avoiding the cost of over-inclusion without under-inclusion. And this idea, they don't explicitly define it, but the idea here is that sometimes we choose using our discretion to not enforce the law. So that sounds a lot like this idea of enforcing some but not all the time. So I'm going to keep it. Capricious is tempting because I remember capricious coming up as a word to describe enforcement. So I've got discretionary non-enforcement or capricious enforcement. So I'm going to think about what they lead me to believe capricious means. So it says, conceivably, maybe an agency would concentrate its resources on those areas of conduct which had been brought inadvertently within the scope of the law, but the author doesn't think that this will happen. The agency doesn't stray too far from the intended. So even if I'm not sure what the word capricious means, the fact that I've got a contrast here, capricious enforcement can happen, but typically they don't stray too far from the intention, means capricious sounds like it's something that strays from the intention of the law, enforcing in a way that the law did not intend, which again is a little different from this idea of enforcing some but not for everyone. It has to do more with kind of passing judgment on how the law is being enforced. All right, so that leaves me with discretionary, answer choice D, which is our correct answer here. Again, let me know if you have any questions. And we're gonna move on to the next one. Give this a Okay. I just realized I've been answering questions in the chat and sending them to panelists, which is not you all. So if you've put a question in the chat, I've gone back now and sent you a personal note with my answer to the question, so check it out. All right, let's go ahead and roll in. Okay. And the poll, thank you to everyone who voted. And let's check this out. So this time, we've got another overlap question, but this is more of a question that blurs the boundaries between author's opinion and inference. So we are asked to think about the opinion that the author of passage A would have about the plan described in passage B. So I want to have kind of the general sense of what was the author's opinion in passage A in mind, and then think about how it applies to specifics of passage B. So reminding myself about the opinions in passage A, I remember that the author kind of endorsed this technique of discretionary non-enforcement as a solution to the problem of balancing over-inclusive laws with, you know, under-inclusive laws that have too many loopholes, and saying that sort of capricious enforcement of that probably wouldn't be a big problem. So in passage B, the plan that's described is this selective cutting of the water. And I remember that I had anticipated when I made my passage map that this was kind of an example of discretionary non-enforcement, this idea that the author of passage A kind of liked and endorsed. So my guess is, you know, before even looking at the answers, I think that author A would be, you know, pretty on board with this. I think author A would say this is an example of discretionary non-enforcement. So that's my prediction. I am going to take a look now at the answer choices. So answer A, officials should not implement the plan until just after the legislature's annual appropriations hearing. So first of all, this is kind of counter to my prediction, right? I thought author A would be in support of this plan. And secondly, I'm not sure where this idea about appropriations or funding comes in. That seems pretty far off from anything I learned about from author A. So I'm going to cross that off. B, at least the plan would have a lower social cost than would turning off the water of all 231,000 households that have not paid on time. So that is positive. It's sort of like a very weakly worded positive, right? Like at least, blah, blah, blah. But it is positive, so I'm going to keep it. And it does talk about lower social costs. And I remember in paragraph 2, they did discuss the costs of over-inclusive laws. Answer choice C, the plan is reasonable response. Okay, I can keep that one. Excuse me. Answer D, a better plan would have been to place liens. Thank you, Virginia. So here, this doesn't sound like author A would be in support, which contradicts my prediction. And also author A didn't really give me any information that would tell me how they feel about placing liens. So I'm going to cross that off. And then instead of implementing the plan, specific laws should be introduced. Again, I think the author would like this plan, so I'm going to cross it off. The author thought there were some problems with sort of overly specific laws. So go back to these two that were positive, and now I know I've got at least a 50-50 shot just by having a sense of what side author A comes down on. So I'm going to take a closer look at C. The plan is a reasonable response to the Water Department's history of enforcing over-inclusive laws to the letter. Ooh, okay, so this is a great example of an LSAT trap, where the first part of the answer choice looks really good. The plan is a reasonable response, right? That seems like what author A would think, and probably like more positive than at least the plan would. But the rest of this is straight up wrong. There's nothing in here that suggests that they have enforced over-inclusive rules to the letter. They've gone for decades without asking these people to pay, or without, giving any consequences for these people who aren't paying their water bill. So this is a trap to watch out for on the LSAT, is letting the front half of an answer fool you into not reading the back half of an answer, which needs to be equally correct. So answer choice C is wrong, and the correct answer here is B. All right, this is where we're going to wrap up. If you're interested in checking out our upcoming classes, you can find the list of courses on our website. And remember that you can try the first session of any of our classes for free. I'll stick around for a minute. If you have any questions, you can throw them in the chat. If not, have a great night. Thank you for coming, and stay safe and well. Nigel, my timing recommendation would be 3 to 4 minutes for the passage, and then 1 minute to 1 minute and 30 per question. Yeah, so Kayla, I would say reading comp skills fall into 2 major buckets. On the one hand, work on improving your passage reading as a whole. And then on the other hand, you've got your more isolated question skills. So I think the first thing would be to figure out which of those is your area of need. And you can tell that kind of by how you do on main idea questions. If you generally get those wrong, then that might mean you want to focus on working on your passage reading skills. If you generally get those right, then you might want to focus more on your question skills. And of course, it can benefit everyone to work on both of those. But I would recommend doing a lot of intentional practice where you say, okay, my goal today as I read this passage is to just practice identifying the author's opinion, or just practice noticing transition words like but or however. Or just practice creating a solid passage map. And also to break down studying for the questions in kind of discrete ways. So today I'm going to practice searching the text, or today I'm going to practice looking for strong language and avoiding it. And there's a lot of great info on our website. You can check out our blog is another free resource that wasn't mentioned here that has some good tips for studying for reading comprehension. And those posts are written by our instructors. Some of them are written by me, so check them out. Chloe, absolutely. You should do lots of LSAT passages to practice reading comp skills. And Carolyn, nope. We switch up the content and we also switch up the instructor. So my colleague Scott Miller hosts half of these. Sometimes we have other instructors host them. And you can take the free prep hours, you can come to as many as you want. And I don't know that there's really a ceiling on the number of trial classes where you take the session 1, but they are all the same content because it's part of a standardized 10-session course. So the only difference you would experience is a difference in instructor. So if you were like shopping around and you wanted to see how different teachers teach, you could come to a few session 1s to figure out what works for you. All right, thanks so much, everybody. I'm gonna hop out now and end the meeting. Have a good one.